This is our group. We were 11 child and adolescent development students. All of the students that went on the trip are all former Metro students and PATH students. It's two of our programs that we have for ECE professionals. And I'm going to let everybody take a minute and introduce themselves. So I'll start off with Tanisha.
Hi, my name is Tanisha Harvey. I am currently a child and adolescent development student here. This is my senior year, and I'm a preschool teacher at Orphalea Child Development Center.
My name is Angelina Mesta. I am currently a junior here at San Francisco State, and I am currently a teacher's assistant at Children's Campus.
Hi, my name is Angela Madriaga. I'm a child development major and also a senior in the PATH program, and I'm a teacher at the UCSF Laurel Heights child care.
Hi, my name is Joanna Quiros, and I'm a CATH graduate, and I'm currently a graduate student at the University of San Francisco, and I'm also the director of the Children, Youth, and Family Services of Family Service Agency San Francisco.
Hi, I'm Chelsea. I'm a CAD graduate and a PATH graduate, and now I am working with Advanced SF as an SFC coordinator.
And Mariana, who's joining us in a second, she's a preschool teacher and an elementary school teacher for San Francisco Unified. So this summer we were in Cape Town, South Africa. We were there for 2 months, so we were there more or less the entire month of June and July. And we were working in a township called Vrybrand, which I'll talk to you about in a little bit, working with our host agency called True North. And True North is a really interesting organization that we were really fortunate to come across. I got to meet the executive director, Vicki Coombe, when she came to San Francisco in the spring of 2013. And she is a partner with one of my former colleagues from Jumpstart. And she was here trying to figure out what was happening around early childhood education here in San Francisco. And we started talking, and her position and her organization is working with preschools in the township of Vrybrand, helping them receive licensure. The national government of South Africa is now funding centers and giving them national subsidies once they become licensed. However, a majority of the centers that are serving children in most of the townships do not meet the standards that they need to in order to become licensed and receive these national subsidies. So she started this organization back in 2007, and they're currently working with 34 preschools and 100 teachers and 1,500 children in Vrybrand. We got to learn a little bit, still learning a ton about where South Africa is in its ECE movement. So ECE, for those of you that don't know, that's early childhood education. There are drastic disparities in funding between low-income centers and affluent centers. It's very similar to what we see here in San Francisco. One of the things that we thought was really interesting is people are starting to recognize the importance of early childhood education in South Africa, but they haven't really figured out what systems need to be in place to raise the quality. And so I was able to go to a lot of very interesting, actually national meetings where they're trying to figure out how do we standardize early childhood education? What should we focus on? Do we focus on teacher development? Do we focus on the environment? Do we focus on building out our own environmental rating scales, or do we adapt existing environmental rating scales? And so they're really grappling with a lot of these issues. It was very interesting because there's a lot of information out there with the internet, but they weren't really incorporating, we didn't see them incorporating that knowledge in the work that they were doing within the national government. So we were in a township called Vrybrand. Vrybrand in Afrikaans means free ground. It is one of the oldest informal townships in the Western Cape. And by informal, it means that a lot of the structures were made out of corrugated tin, dirt floors or cement floors. In about 1980s, they did start having some formal structures built. It is a very mixed township, so what we learned when we were in Cape Town is a lot of the townships might be all Xhosa or all Cape Malay, but Fragran was very, very mixed. There was Xhosa, Zulu, Malawi refugees from Sierra Leone. So it was a very kind of mixed group. In a lot of our classrooms, there was multiple languages being spoken in each of the classrooms. And it's a small township. The township size was about 40,000 inhabitants. So we went there, and the students, so you're going to see lots of pictures. The pictures, I think, speak for themselves. But we went there, and the students were there to exchange ideas, to learn new techniques, and to model best practices in the classroom. So implementing small group time and one-on-one reading and leading children in transitions. And so we're going to go through now and kind of talk about what it looked like in the preschools every day.
So ECHRS. So I was in charge of conducting the ECHRS assessments in 14 of the creches, so the preschools. And True North's goal is to establish a baseline as far as like where are they in their environments, what kind of teacher development trainings they have to sort of put together, what kind of resources are they, wanting to prioritize. Just like in the U.S., it's going to be tied to funding at some point, so they're really trying to just establish a baseline. It was a difficult thing to do because, as we know, ECHRS was sort of developed for this sort of cultural and this cultural context, and so finding ways to adapt it and then establish some kind of baseline based on that was a little challenging. So I had to kind of think outside of the box because there is no tool that they have available over there. So they've heard about the ECHRS, and so we made different adaptations. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the different activities. And I also trained 5 program staff. They had been exposed to the ECHRS and they had developed, a training, but no one that had actually done these assessments formally. So I partnered with them, and also the students expressed interest in doing ECHRS. And so out of the 11 students, half of them expressed interest in, shadowing one of us to go and conduct these assessments. And so we'll talk a little bit more as we get through the different slides.
So our weekly routine was that we were working about 5 days a week. We worked at 2 different schools with 2 different people. So on Monday and Wednesday, we would work at one center with one of our partners. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we work at another center. And we started at 8 a.m. and we would be in the schools until about 12:30, just supporting the teachers and kind of just looking in the classroom. And around 12:30 is when we would walk over to True North, and we would kind of have lunch, and after that we would kind of go over what our day looked like, what happened throughout the day, some observations, kind of reflect about how we think things went, and also work on some projects that we had. So collecting the data of the children's information, and creating things for the teachers to use inside the classroom.
So life in the creches. So we spent the majority of our time in the creches themselves, and a lot of them varied in what they, in a lot of different aspects. Structure was one way. One of the sites that we worked in was Masekule, and it was built 2 years ago, and it's one of the only 2-story buildings in Fragran. And then also, if you can see in the left-hand picture, that's a garage where an infant room is, and actually right there in the front is a car itself. We also noticed it was rainy season, so there was a lot of leaks. Also floors, all the mold and mildew, which we weren't as used to. Also the number of sinks and toilets were just very different compared to what we're used to in the United States.
So for mealtime. If you look on the photos, you'll see that some of the centers had tables and chairs for the children to have meals, but some of them didn't. So the children would usually sit in a circle on the floor, and they would either eat from plates, or either from their individual plates, or they would have one shared plate where they would all eat with their hands, which we thought was kind of an issue because some of them didn't have sinks for hand washing, but we'll talk about that later. The different types of lunches that were provided, because of the income disparity, some of the schools weren't able to provide food for the children, so they would have to bring it from their homes. And a lot of the times in lunch, you might see where one child has like pasta and like some vegetables or some crackers. Another child might have 2 pieces of bread and a lollipop. And it's like for us, that was like a big shock, because you're thinking like, oh my goodness, all you have to eat is 2 pieces of bread. And they're like, yay, today my mom gave me 2 pieces of bread. And it was kind of a shock for us. But one thing that was, I don't know how to say it, but one thing that kind of warmed our hearts was the amount that children share. And so it never really mattered how much food your parents had to give you to bring to school. If there was food in the school, everybody was going to eat. And on a particular day at one of my sites, one of the children had forgotten their lunch. And so the teacher just got a plate, and she's like, oh no, this child doesn't have anything to eat. And even kids who had 1 piece of bread would tear that piece of bread in half and put it on the plate. So at the end of the day, that kid had like a whole plate of food to eat. And then even in turn shared it with other people. They're like, well, now I'm done, now I want to share it back. And that's something very different from here, where the children aren't allowed to share their food because of all different allergies and things. So it's like, no, keep your food on your plate, stay in your area. And it wasn't like that.
Okay, technical malfunctions. Hi. Hi, sorry. No worries.
So while we're getting the projector,
Here we go. We're on activities now. There you go.
Okay, so activities. As you know, there are some disparities between the centers themselves. So some centers would have more materials to use to manipulate, whereas some centers would have to make do with what they have. And so there are weekly themed activities in these centers as provided by True North. However, within the classroom, we would see materials that they would use that are often recycled. So, like part of the activities would usually involve using old containers as a means to, use as a manipulative activity, or old shoe boxes where children can draw in and paint in so that they can, use that material to, expand their imagination and make something out of a material that's, very simple, yet it's complex enough for them to be able to express their imagination. So a lot of the activities that were in the center were still, they were focused on the theme based on the week. For example, there would be a theme based on a season. So it would be autumn before, in the beginning of June, it's autumn in Cape Town. So children will talk about autumn, and then their teachers will guide them through different ways people celebrate autumn, what happens during autumn. And so a lot of those are implemented in the classroom, and so we definitely saw that.
As we look at activities through the Edgar's lens, what we sort of, the way we adapted, in the US, it's all about access. And so do children have access to these materials? Given that some classrooms were, very small, 8 by 8, and there was like 20 kids there, what the teachers did, which was very, very creative, was when there was activities set up based on curriculum, they would pull out the materials and set it up for the children, but then they had to move that desk or that table with the activities to put another activity. So it was that constant change, and so the credit was given to them if the materials were available in the crèche and not necessarily accessible.
Can I add one more thing? That was also a big thing we saw was a choice. There wasn't as much choice with activities as we see here in the US, but that kind of goes with the space. They could only put one activity out at a time and then bring the other one out. So we saw why there wasn't choice offered as much.
So space was also an issue that came up with outdoor play. Some centers had a large enough space for the children to be able to go out and play, but some of them were a little bit smaller and they didn't have as much room. Some places had structures where the children were able to climb on, but they weren't always the safest. There were some structures where they would have pieces that would be falling off, and so that was a little bit of a worry and a concern that we had. And there was also a limited amount of parks that were at in Fregron, because there wasn't that many. There was maybe one new one that they just created, but even there was a lot of safety hazards because there would be broken glass, and we were very worried that the children might, fall or something, but they were able to have that as their own choice and their own way to play. That was kind of the one thing they did have control over. And there was even a park at True North where they would bring children to go to, but even when that happened, there would be multiple children in multiple schools going, and so there was a lot of issues with outdoor play that we saw.
The playground at True North was probably, would you say, it's maybe like the size of this space, maybe a little bit bigger, and sometimes you'd have over 100 children outside playing, so 3 schools would show up at the same time to play outside.
There's like balls flying across and
a stage with 20 children jumping up and dancing, and even Chelsea pointed out in this structure, like if you can see there's like a different board built on there, like at one point one of those boards while everybody was up there just kind of fell off, and so did the children.
So as we look at toileting, we assessed about 14 different preschools, and because of the resources that the preschool had, there was limited in terms of whether or not there were sinks, and so there was a picture later on, actually in the next one, that shows how creative the preschool principals got around, providing water so that they could be the hand washing, because they really emphasized that there was a constant hand washing, and so they did really, really good. Some of them was, they grabbed one of the, they had either the children washing their hands in the same container, but then some of them would use a cup to pour the water, and so they would wash it like sort of outside of the container, but water is not always accessible, and so they had to get really creative around, like the hand washing, but they did. Most of the preschools got credit for the hand washing because they really did it, according to what the Eckers suggest.
And this has been, like, in talking to True North, they've really made a lot of strides. So 2 years ago, when they first started working in the townships, there was no hand washing going on. And I think, as Johanna was saying, it was a big challenge. And when I went to one of the national meetings, in a lot of the informal settlements, there's no access to water. And so you see a lot of these, we don't have pictures of them, but they're similar to this, where they use like portable porta potties, and that's all you really have to use. And so you had to say, you had to be really, really creative. And I think that's one of the big things that you saw in some of the national meetings, was struggling around how to increase quality when you don't have the infrastructure built into the country to support it.
Nap time. One of the biggest things we saw with nap time, when it was nap time there, it was nap time. Kids were out asleep, or they're at least laying on their cots. Another thing that was a lot different for us, we're used to licensing where kids have to be a certain amount of inches apart. And these children are sharing cots, sharing blankets, but they're always head to toe. Always head to toe.
So that was just a quick overview of what it looked like in the classroom on a daily basis. On the afternoons, we had the opportunity to help True North with a couple of the projects they were doing. So the first month we were there, we actually observed their teacher trainings that they did. And we were kind of chomping at the bit to get in there and do our own teacher trainings. The teacher trainings that we observed were very, very they were very, this is how you do it, and there wasn't really any explanation of the why, and it wasn't a very active, they weren't involving the teachers so much. And so we asked them if we could provide some teacher trainings for the last month that we were there. And we really focused on language and literacy development and supporting children's social emotional growth in the classroom. And it was really amazing to see. They hadn't really focused or ever discussed with the teachers what child outcomes were, or what child outcomes could look like in the classroom. And so we were amazed because we presented them with some of the child outcomes that we use here in the United States and had them work in groups to discuss how they're supporting the different child outcomes in their classroom. And we were all amazed at just the depth of knowledge that teachers had. And so their educational levels, I think the typical education level was around maybe a 9th or 10th grade educational level, yet they had incredible insight, and they nailed all of the outcomes. And they were able to do what we called make and takes, and so they made song charts and storybook extensions and homemade books, and they really enjoyed themselves. And so we're hoping when we go back next year that we can continue on with our teacher trainings.
So Friday and weekend outings. On Fridays we didn't work, so those are the days we got to go out and kind of explore more of South African and see more of their culture. And so one of the first places that we went to along the way was Robben Island, and this was the prison where Nelson Mandela was incarcerated. And so we kind of got to take a bus tour and went around the prison grounds, and also got to see the cell where Mandela was held. It's actually right over there, the picture on the right. And we also celebrated Mandela Day down in South Africa, and we saw that it was a really big, important day where they honored Nelson Mandela, and it was a huge community event where the schools, kind of all came together and, really showed their appreciation they had for Nelson Mandela. And we had a teddy bear picnic, and where we made sandwiches and sang songs with the kids, and it was really fun and really interactive for everyone. And we also went to another school that was right across the street from where True North was at, Capricorn, and got to see how that school looked like and what they did as their curriculum.
It was really interesting to see also the disparity between the elementary schools and the preschools. So this elementary school was very, very well resourced. Actually, Elton John had come in the 90s and had given a ton of money for AIDS. And so now that they really have the AIDS epidemic under control, they've given all the money back to the schools. But again, they're focusing on K-12 education and not early childhood education. So this was a pretty well-resourced elementary school.
So in addition to the excursions that we were doing, we also explored Table Mountain and Lion's Head. So Table Mountain is one of the 7 wonders of nature in South Africa. And this is just a time for us to really reflect on ourselves. And as teachers, this occupation tends to be really stressful at times. So part of our respite ways to cope with the stressors, we would go on hikes, nature walks, to take care of ourselves. And we were also able to visit the Cape of Good Hope. It's the innermost tip of South Africa. And after that, we also had the opportunity to visit another township called Langa. So this township is, we'll say, a little bit more developed than Vredgrond. It's
Primarily
Xhosa. And so we were able to see a different cultural aspect of a different township versus the township that we were working in. And we also went on a few adventures. As you can see, we were able to see cheetahs and lions, and paragliding, shark cage diving. So just some of the activities that we engaged in to take care of ourselves mostly for stress. Respite time.
So our outcomes, it was really hard to really quantify our outcomes, but one of the things that we didn't have a slide for, but we did work with the nursing department, and so the child development students were able to take over 200 children to the clinic, and this is something that they've never been able to do, and we were able to support the children in acquiring health screening, deworming treatments, and updating shots and vaccines. We modeled and facilitated elements of the daily routine to improve preschool quality for over 300 children. We developed language and literacy enhancements for 10 preschools, evaluated 14 preschools using the ECHRS, and trained 5 True North staff on evaluation and observation techniques. We provided 2 teacher trainings, supporting over 30 teachers. We supported the attainment of licensure through the completion of the minimum standards and child roster updates. And I facilitated weekly child development trainings for the True North program staff. So in total, we did 1,408 direct hours of service in the classrooms and 1,306 technical assistance hours with the host agency. So that was, providing doing the minimum standards checklists and all of that good stuff. And it was a total of 2,714 service hours. So the major takeaways, so this is really where everybody's just going to share out some of the major takeaways that we had from the trip.
Okay, self-regulation skills. Before we actually started working in the creches, we visited Overcome, which is an informal settlement in Fuegon, and we were able to go into 3 different creches there and just observe. And right when we got back into the van, all of us were just like, oh my goodness, did you see those kids? They can all get in a circle so fast. They all stood in line. And they were, just their self-regulation skills were just out of this world compared to what we see here in the U.S. And, sorry.
Were you talking about
the
Sarita's class?
Yeah, so this really tied into a lot of us in our special education class. We were discussing an article one time about how children who have multiple risk factors in their life, how they thrive more with strict boundaries. And we could really see that there. The teachers are a lot stricter than the ones here in the U.S., but we saw how the children were more engaged in activities, and there was less violence between children. They were just really able to thrive in the classroom with those strict boundaries in place.
Developmentally appropriate. So initially when we went into the classroom, being in an environment that was so teacher directed and there wasn't that much choice, we were taken aback. But developmentally, like Chelsea said, the children really thrived in that environment. And a lot of the things that the children were doing there, like if you see Keanu here in the middle, Keanu's 3, and he sat for about half an hour stringing small wooden beads onto a string. His fine motor skills were like out of this world. Like for a 3-year-old, usually you wouldn't put this activity out because you would be like, no, that's not appropriate. They'd get too frustrated. The beads are too small. They could choke. All these things that went through my head when I saw the teacher say, we're gonna do beads with strings. And I was like, wait a minute, like that's not like. I was like, okay, seriously, this is gonna happen. And like the children, they did it. Like they all sat in a little circle, and she passed out beads like a handful at a time, and they sat so patiently, and they sat there and he put each bead on the string. So being like one of the main differences from here to there is even though we have all of this knowledge and all of this expertise, it only pertained to the classrooms here in America. Because once we got there, we realized that the children and the environment, although they may have been different, they had strengths that we didn't have.
Another big developmentally appropriate or a skill that I saw was infants feeding themselves with spoons, so they're able to hold a spoon and feed themselves. I thought that really stood out to me.
And feed each other.
Yeah. On this one you have, because this is my school, probably. This is Keanu and Gloria, and during breakfast, Keanu was kind of tired, so he didn't want to eat, and Gloria was like, you're not done. So she got his bowl and his spoon, and Keanu's 3 and Gloria's only 2.5. And she got his bowl and spoon, and she scooped out the food, and she would go, "Here, Keanu," and he would turn, and she fed him all of his porridge. Pretty amazing.
So what we realized is that despite the lack of resources, that, you know, when we first got there, it was like we thought, oh, there's not going to be a lot of resources, so we're going to have to get like really creative. What we found is like, despite the fact that there was not enough resources, you know, and it kind of varied from school to school, but the schools that had the resources, like, you still saw children that were really, really engaged in activities, and teachers just got really creative. There was a one time where I was doing an Eckers assessment, and the teacher was narrating a story, and so where she left off, the child will pick it up. And it was just like, and this was like 3- and 4-year-olds. And they would act out the story, and then it would go back to her, and it was just kind of, you know, you don't see those things here where a 3-year-old can really pick up the story wherever the teacher left off. And so it just kind of told me, you know, like, wow, despite the resources, they did whatever they could, and teachers were just really creative and got the children really engaged.
Maybe you want to add anything to that?
To resources? Oh, like, typically here, our resources are paid for. I don't know. We go out and we buy lots of things for our classrooms, but in those classrooms where they weren't able to purchase a lot of things, you got to see how creative they were with things that we would usually throw away. Like in the other slide, you saw that the children were painting with the egg cartons. It's like when you're done with toilet paper, it isn't trash. Like they turned them into birds and butterflies. It was like everything that they had, they used. And even though it wasn't a lot, there was never really oh, I need this for this activity or that for that activity. It was like, what can I use that I already have or that someone else is not using? And they would just use everything.
That's me. So pretty much I got to work with Kanyalanga. That was my favorite crutch I had too, but that was like totally my favorite one. I got to work with Tamia, teacher Tamia, and principal Piwei. So pretty much I got to build a beautiful relationship with both Tamia and Tamia and Piwei. There was 13 students in the crèche, and there was half of them were infant and toddlers, the other ones were preschoolers. But during my time there, at first it was really hard to connect with Piwei because she thought that I was one of those weird Americans, which I told them, well, I'm Mexican, but you know, I'm technically American because I'm in another country. But something that I really learned from teacher Piwei, she was really scared of me because she thought that I was really like, you know, I knew what I was doing there. But me sharing my story that I came from an immigrant background and pretty much telling them that I was, you know, pretty much learning English and all those things pretty much helped her become like really close to me. So now that I'm here in the US, me and her and Tamia, we actually send a lot of emails just talking about fashion, about exchanging curriculum ideas, and we just became really good friends. And I'm really thankful that I got the opportunity to work with both of the teachers. And yeah, that's something that I learned in Africa, you know.
So in South Africa, teachers sort of manage their classrooms by doing like whole group activities, like big groups. Like you see teachers like with circle time, and whereas here, you know, we value small groups and individualized care. Over there, it's pretty much because of the lack of resources. I mean, there's one teacher for 20 kids. And so the teachers sort of use that. And what I got from it, and one of my biggest takeaways is like, how can we still, you know, combine the small groups and individualized care, but also provide those opportunities for children to engage in big groups? Because part of what I saw was that it sort of gave children a sense of belonging and a sense of community, because they were doing, you know, as you saw, even for meal times, they were like feeding each other, and there was a lot of empathy and sympathy within the children. So it was kind of really, it was really awesome to see.
I think one of the greatest things we all agreed that we took away from South Africa was the strong sense of community. And in Xhosa, there's a word called Ubuntu, and it roughly translates to I am because we are. And we've all given a lot of examples of it today. One of the ones that I saw was a young girl. She was picking up everyone's bowls after breakfast, and they dropped, and everyone stood up and started picking them up. Or we did an obstacle course and everyone's screaming each other's names, saying, you got it, you got it. And I think we all just loved the feel in the classrooms, and we all really wanted to bring that back into our own.
And I think one of the things that we had multiple discussions about, this is one of my favorite pictures that was taken, it's Crystal and Bridget, who they're both working today and they weren't able to make it. Everybody wore tracksuits in their preschools, so the teachers and the children, and Crystal and Bridget on their last week there, they got their own tracksuits. But we really just felt that there was way more similarities than differences, in particular around how early childhood educators were viewed. So there was a lack of, a staff development, a lack of, prep time, huge wage disparities. When we're talking about early childhood educators in South Africa, the average salary was $100 a month. And for a lot of them, there was a lot of turnover because they could easily get a job as a nanny and make 4 times that amount of money. But a lot of them wanted to be in the preschools because they believed in it and they were really passionate about the work that they did. And we really felt that that was really similar to what we see with the early childhood educators here in the United States. And so I think that was really, I think when we were leaving, I think we just realized that we thought that we were going to go there and really support the implementation of best practices. But I think when we left, we really realized that we were coming home with way more than we were leaving. Does anybody want to add anything to that before we get into the questions and answers?
I would say that my major takeaway, or something that really stood out to me being on this trip and everything, is the amount of relevance a culture can actually influence the way we educate our young children. So as we've seen in the conditions that were in Fregron and the schools that were in Fregron, a lot of the influence around the way teachers approach teaching their children have really come from the cultural beliefs that they had. And as Chelsea said, a community-based, culture really means that, when one's struggling, everyone's there to help them out. And the way we kind of saw that is, how children, when their peers are struggling with an activity, they're there to, cheer them on, to encourage them to work harder. Or, if, another child is, struggling to feed themselves, as we saw in one of the slides, they're there to really support each other. And I think that socio-emotionally, this is where they're learning and this is the context that they're learning. And as a teacher, I've really taken that, I've become more culturally competent because I understand that being a teacher now in the school that I'm at, there are going to be a lot of children coming from different cultural contexts from their own home. And how do we include that in our classrooms is something that has really shaped me has really influenced me as a teacher today, because I feel that it's really important to see the child as a whole child rather than just continue to tell them, this is the way we're going to teach in the classroom, so it's one size fits all, whereas instead really focusing on the strengths that the children do have and the culture that they do come with into the classroom.
Anything else? Okay. So I also just want to say something that you always want to tear up, that I was just really proud of our group. I think it was a tough, if I can go back to the number of hours that they served, but it was a tough trip. We were there for 8 full weeks, and everybody works full time, and we left the weekend after graduation and hit the ground running. We flew over. It was a very long trip. It was 36 hours of flying over. We got there. We had 1 day of orientation, and then we jumped right into the preschools, and they were in the preschools, like I said, from 8 a.m. and left the township every day until 4, worked until about sometimes at night until 8 p.m. and really overcame a lot of obstacles and challenges, and then flew right back to the United States, and most people started work that next week. And I also wanted to give thanks to Elaine Schilling, who's didn't speak today, but Elaine was able to come for 2 weeks and help out, and she's helping to oversee the program next year as well. So, yeah. All right, any questions that anybody has?
Do you think that the collaborative community feeling in Legon was reflective of larger South African values, or was it specific to that township? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, it's interesting. I read a really interesting article while I was there because I was asked at one point to help identify a new curriculum because they were really struggling with what type of curriculum they could use. The curriculum that they had adopted was written by a former, I think, 4th grade teacher, and you saw a lot of this kind of, there was nobody with a background in early childhood education, and the individuals that were working in ECE really came from K-12 system. So even in True North, a lot of the staff were former high school teachers. And so the curriculum that True North was using was incredibly teacher directed, and it was really, even though it was developed by a South African, we really felt it not to be culturally relevant to the children. So for example, with our first week there, the curriculum was about pets and how to care for your pet. And we were like, okay, people don't have really pets like we would call them here in the township. And so I started doing a lot of digging around what type of curriculums were out there. And I found this really beautiful article called The Miseducation of African ECE in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And it was really talking about how so often people are coming in with Western views and beliefs around what high quality early childhood education should look like, and really forgetting what are the core beliefs and values of Africans. And the big finding was that there is this sense of community. And in the US, we're so focused on school success outcomes and, developing these skills. And kind of like Angela hit on, we don't really focus on what it means to be a member of a community and a member of society. And that's so ingrained in everyone. And so I don't think it was something that was just unique to Vrygrond. And I think that's why the Ubuntu actually became really, I don't know if anybody saw this, but it was like one of those viral Facebook posts actually while we were in South Africa, and we're like, oh look, it's in Xhosa. And that really was, I just think it's one of those things that you can read about and you can study, but it's not until you actually experience it and you see the way infants, toddlers, and preschools are really interacting with each other, do you realize that we've got a lot of work to do in the United States to ever get to that point of really having this sense of community. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
So just gonna touch a little bit about, I'm not sure if we're all familiar with South Africa's history with apartheid, and a lot of that is culturally there's still that disparity within different societies, and we can see that in Cape Town, like the extreme inequities between places with higher social status versus the townships. And so as an observation would probably be that there's still a lot of that solidarity within the groups that have experienced apartheid, and it might be a contribution to how they treat each other as a means to actually be able to find strength in each other, in their own liberation. And so that's something that we've observed.
Yeah.
I don't know a lot about South Africa, so I'm curious, how common is it for kids to be in preschool? Or is it more common for kids to be reared by families or relatives? And I just want to see the context with which children come to school and what families make those choices or don't choice. I'd just love to hear about that. And I'm sorry I'm late if I missed that.
No. So what we were working in, if you could go back to the 80s, for those of you that remember what kind of daycare looked like in the 80s, A lot of the preschools were like this hybrid of family childcare / daycares, and they were all over the place. And so when I went to this one national meeting, I mean, they were saying that they felt, I think there's something, it was some incredible number, that 80% of children living in the townships were in creches, is what they call them. And it was one of the reasons is because so many people need to seek employment, and so it's really daycare in the sense. So it's a place where I can leave my child, and they're paying really low. I think it was like 50 rand
a day,
or
300 rand a month,
which is like $30 a month to send your child to one of the creches.
But a preschool teacher was making $100.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So, you saw a lot of people, so they were using it was more for care, and so this idea of education and educating children in preschools was something that was new. So it was just, there were a lot of, it was really similar to what you see happening here in, I think, San Francisco as we try to raise quality, because it was, where do we begin? Because we can't really start raising quality standards until we raise educational levels, but where do you, if you can't compensate, and then how do you really raise educational levels? And people just needed care, and they needed affordable care, and that was the primary objective. But then you had the South African government, because they're trying to figure out a way to close the opportunity gap in education, really kind of being like, okay, we've got to do something with preschool, but not even knowing how to begin wrapping their heads around it. Yeah.
So one thing that I noticed was even though a lot of children were in a crush, like younger than 5, if the family had another child or child previously, if that child was old enough to care for that child, then neither one of them would be in school. Because if you couldn't afford for both children to go, then they wouldn't, and you already had someone to care for your child. So as many children as were in the crushes, like some of them, classrooms might have had 30 children with one teacher. There were a lot of children who just played in the streets all day, like with tires and climbing fences, and a lot of them were elementary school age children, and they just play.
Mm-hmm. And some of the principals decided to still, like some families couldn't afford to pay, they would still take the child at no pay, because they wanted to just really have that child in their school. And so, it was going back to like, like I'm not getting paid for this child, but, it's better here than just in their home. And so that was pretty, like it was really telling. And that's why they're looking to get licensed and, like use the resources that True North has so that they can get subsidy from the country.
Mm-hmm.
They also didn't have the age limits that we have. Even though like a crush might be only from 0 to 4, you might have children who are 8 years old and 7 years old in your kindergarten or grade R class because they either couldn't get into the elementary school or their parents couldn't afford to send them there, so they would just send them to the crush.
Well, and then there was also in Fredonia there were a lot of refugees, and so there were kind of a lot of refugees that weren't really, they were new and they weren't really accessing the school system yet, and so, you had these children, mixed-age children in the preschool classroom a lot of times.
I was wondering what your observations were. You mentioned that a lot of, there were a lot of languages in your classrooms, and so I'm wondering what you observed the teachers, how they supported children who had multiple languages, and kind of what you saw there, and then how that maybe influences how you think about working with children from multiple language backgrounds here in your classrooms here.
One example was one little boy only spoke Shona in one of our classrooms, and there was 2 older boys who also spoke Shona, so a lot of the times the teacher would use another child who knows that language too to be a translator, and then actually by the end, Angelina remembers him too, Divine. By the end of our trip, he's actually speaking words in English. Like, it was pretty amazing to see how far he came in 2 months.
But I also feel like just about all the teachers were bilingual. So most of the Cape Malay descendants spoke Afrikaans, and a lot of the, well, it was either the black population was either Xhosa, or there were some Malawi teachers as well. And so everybody was bilingual, and so I feel like when you are bilingual, you're more apt to support language development of another child. And so there was a lot of this kind of peer support going on, and there were some centers where, you know, they would sing songs in multiple languages, and sometimes you weren't. I remember we would go and we were like, "What language are they speaking right now?" Because sometimes it would be this hybrid of like almost like Xhosa Afrikaans and English that people were speaking.
And I also want to add that the children who were also dual language speakers, they would support their peers if their peers like spoke their native language but not English. Whereas another peer would speak their native language and English, they would help translate for their peers. So for an example, in my crush, one of the children, I was letting him know that, you know, it's time for this person's turn, and then he'll tell me, must I say that in my language, teacher? Then he'll translate to his friend to let them know that it's, you know, it's their turn. And so that really helps too, because the children do support each other in their language as well.
I'm curious about all your discussions around the collectivism you saw there and experienced. I'm curious, how does that shape your work here, and what you think is possible within this culture, which is different, obviously. But I'm curious how, it seems like that was a very powerful part of the experience. I'm curious about the long-term impact on that.
Well, I think that what it brought to me was this idea of like how many of our teachers could really benefit from having this experience where this is really valued, where, you know, here we value sort of the individualized, and what I feel it's important is that what we can get from our experience in South Africa, how can we bring it here and really incorporate that into our activities and the way we do you know, schooling here with our children and in our programs. So for me, it was really tying it back to like, how can we allow, you know, more teachers to have this amazing experience where this is really valued. Not that it's not valued here, but it's not as much as we, you know, in our experience in South Africa. So,
is there anything that you're going to adopt at your center?
Well, so in South Africa, they would call circle time was ring time. And so I actually started introducing that concept with our teachers to see what they thought. And actually we brought, recently I did the Make and Take workshop, the one we did in South Africa. We did it here with our teachers, and they were just really excited. And it just reminded me of when we had this Make and Take in South Africa, how teachers felt really valued and really heard, and, you know, they had an opportunity to just connect with each other, and just like, it wasn't like someone just, you know, providing information. Like, we gave them an overview of this is the why, this is how this can support you and the strategies that you do in your classrooms and how the flow of the classroom goes. So it was really just that for, you know, the teachers when we did it here on site, and now teachers. So I'm starting, you know, like, I brought a lot of things from South Africa that I'd love to incorporate into our setting, into our center. And so it's just kind of starting that conversation with the teachers, and I'm actually going to be doing a presentation for them because they all want to know, like, how was it, and, you know, I was keeping them sort of up to date with everything that we were doing over there, and they just want to know more about it. And I think this cultural piece that Angela brought up, you know, just kind of has given me, you know, I'm more conscious of how, you know, I can use sort of the cultural piece, because we serve, like in my center, we serve over 230 families every year, and there's families from different backgrounds and different cultures. And so how do we provide services that are sensitive and that it's inclusive of their culture, whatever their culture is, because even within a culture, there's cultures, and so it's just, so my head is kind of spinning with all the things that, would love to incorporate.
Anybody else have anything they want to add to that?
Well, so we're more alike than we are different. And I think in America, the individualist attitude is solely focused on how you're different from the person or people next to you. That coming back, it kind of helped me to realize that focusing on how we're more alike, it makes it easier to have connections with other people, to kind of build that community, and then from there you celebrate how you're different. It's not, oh, we're different, so we can't be friends, and I'm not going to hang out with you. It's like, oh my gosh, we both have hair and 2 eyes. That is so awesome. And then you go into, well, your hair is straight and my hair is all kinky. That's even more cool because we both have hair and our hair is different. And I think that's something coming back into the centers when you have kids who are new or even kids that have been there before, making the focus on how much alike we are, how we all like the same things that we like that are the same. We all wear clothes, like we all have shoes, we all have 2 feet. Once you start on that point, then you can take it to how you're different, but it sort of shifts it from we're different so we can't versus we're so much the same and we're different, so now we can do 2 separate things, and then when you add 2 more separate things, you can build you can build everything up versus building it away from each other.
Thank you. I love what you just said. And thank you for all. This has been really touching to me and moving. I have 100 questions, but I'll ask you Lucia another time. I'm wondering a couple of things. One is about family involvement, and we're engaged with the families. Are they engaged in the programs? Did you interact with the families?
It's interesting because that was, when we were there, that was one of the new pillars that they were adding into True North's scope of work. There was some family involvement, I think, on the center level. I think it really varied by the center. Tanisha, you look like you wanted to say something. Do you have something that you want to add from your experience on how people were involved?
So when I first, my background wasn't really in infant and toddler, but when I got there, I got to be the new infant toddler teacher. So it's like anyone who has children knows that like your attachment to your small child is really strong. And initially, like parents wouldn't give their kids to me, even though I'd be like, hi, I'm the new teacher, you could bring them over to this nice little infant area. They would only give their child to the other teacher, and then she would bring them to me. But then after a while, I would just like talk to them and sort of tell them like what I was doing, and like they were asking me all of these questions like, why are there toys here? There's never toys for my child to play with. Like one father said, there's never toys for my child to play with. What are you doing in this little area wanting me to give you your child, wanting me to give you my child? And I was like, well, these toys are softer for her because I noticed last time that she bumped her head on the table, so we kind of separated them from the other kids so they don't get stepped on because she's so tiny. And when he saw that I was coming from like a caring perspective, then when he shared it with his wife, she came in and she was like, I love this little area that is here for the kids. And it's like from there, then she told one of the other moms like, oh, you should make sure you give your baby to that teacher because she really cares a lot about them, and she's really helping them to have their own little space because they're babies, and some of the big toys they might eat or get hurt. So just like having that dialogue with them and like making that relationship, when I would see them when I was out in the township, they always be like, hi, what are you doing, or where are you going? And like it made it like a little family. Like I was invited into their family.
And we don't have pictures of the center that Tanisha is talking about, I don't think, but that is one of the things that we did really, especially, I'm going to just bring us back to the car in the infant toddler room. So especially with the infant toddler classrooms, I mean, we were really working with some really interesting spatial constraints. And so, we really had to kind of be creative. I think for us there was ways in that we could kind of move, even if it was just those, those big, I don't know, oversized like plastic containers to kind of put off, like have a place designated for the infants in particular, because sometimes Bridget and Crystal would have a heart attack because that car, it looks actually really nice in the picture, but it was actually rusty. They're like, what do we do when the infants crawl under the car? I think, like some of the families were seeing some of the changes that we were making. I think one of the things that even True North was hesitant about having us come in, because I think one of the things that's so difficult with volunteers is you're coming into another culture, you're formulating really close ties, but you're only there for a short amount of time. And so we wanted to build really close relationships with the children, but the primary relationships we really focused on building were with the teachers. So we could really kind of have an exchange with the teachers. And so it'd be interesting to see what we could do around family involvement the next time. But I think, it's been interesting to see how much everybody's been staying in contact, I think, with everyone. We're still getting letters from the teachers, and I don't think that they looked at us so differently. And I think, Mariana kind of touched on it, but when we were leaving, I got so many, the teachers and the principals kept coming up to me just being like, thank you so much for this opportunity. They had foreign volunteers come in before, but they were kind of your typical American volunteers, that I'm coming in with these limitless pockets of money to just give you money and kind of throw money at the issue, whereas they just felt that our group of students were so different because they actually came in and cared, and they could relate on so many different levels. So a decent number of the crew, over half, have came from other countries, and are know what it's like to be from a different land and to speak another language. And so there was a lot of kind of, I think, authentic connections that they weren't familiar with having when interacting with Americans. And so it was one conversation that I was having in a teacher training, and they were kind of in this odd sense kind of rationalizing why the quality of the preschools were so low in the township. And I just said, I'm frustrated by this conversation because I feel like this is what we talk about here in the United States so much, is why is, you can go to Constantia, which was this really affluent white area in Cape Town, that's where all the vineyards are, and you will go to some of the most high quality preschools you've ever seen. So it's not like they don't know what high quality preschool looks like. But it's just in the townships, all of a sudden you start setting the standards so low. And I said, we see the same exact thing in the United States. And so I started talking about, the racial disparities that happen in the United States. And everybody was like, huh? That happens in the US? And so, there's this image of what it is like to be an American. And I think we were really able to kind of demonstrate that actually America isn't all that's portrayed and Hollywood makes us out to be.
So what else did the teachers say, or did they, about the background and education experience our students have versus other volunteers who come in and maybe don't have a child development background or experience working with young children?
I think that's where the connection happened, when they realized we had the same struggles that they did over there, that we struggle with the same challenges here. And that's where I think it was week 4. They finally realized that, wow, you guys are very similar to us. We have so many things that we can identify with. And so we started to share and open up hey, yes, as a teacher, I struggle with that too. And so how can we, support you with it? And I felt that was where we found the connection, and they found the connection, because at first they viewed us as just like any other volunteer that goes into their crèche. And I'm here for a few weeks and I'm just here to support, where we really were there for 2 months. But it wasn't until week 4 or 5 that we felt that connection, where they really just started to trust us. And we weren't there, we weren't judging their work, we kind of could identify with their struggles. And so I think for me and I think we all sort of share that it was that was where we felt that there was a connection.
And there was this sense of like, wow, you can get a degree in child development. And I was like, yeah, you know, people get degrees in child development because right now there it's more of a technical degree that you would get at the community college level. So it's very vocational. And I think, I don't know, True North is now like, well, we don't think we want any volunteers anymore that aren't like your students. We only want your students to come because they actually get it. You know, they didn't have to do any training. You know, our students, you know, everybody was really able to just kind of go in and hit the ground running with understanding early childhood. It was just the more assimilating and understanding the culture that.
Even when we shared about like our, you know, like where we lived, like yes, we also live in communities where there's gangs and violence and, you know, like where they thought like, oh, these wealthy people, they're just coming like any, you know, like we were there just to really provide support. And, you know, I think like, yeah, we're still going to school and we work full time. So we go to school at night or we go on the weekends. And so that sort of like was really, really helpful for them and, you know, even for us too, because we, you know, that's where we really felt the connection. Relate.
Anything?
You didn't address this today, but I read the blog that you all put together, which you should talk about because it was really fantastically well written. I was interested in the way that religion played a part in the education. Some of you wrote about how that they spoke about the Bible or sang religious songs, and that some of you weren't totally comfortable with that because it conflicts with the way we do public education here. I was wondering if you could talk about
that. So, because just like how we talked about the culture is different, religion is so ingrained in the culture that it wasn't separate from education. So in the morning when they had morning ring, when they would do stories, they would be stories from the Bible. It wasn't like Go Dog Go or Corduroy the Bear. It was like, the story for today is Jonah. Like the story for today is Moses. The songs that they sung, a lot of them were like traditional Sunday and Sabbath school songs. And like everyone would sing together and it was, I don't know, it was different, but it made you, once you got over the initial, like, whoa, church and school, don't do that. It's like, we don't do that. Like, I don't know what to say. Like everyone's gonna pray right now. Should I close my eyes? Are we all the same religion? It's like once you got over that, it kind of strengthened the sense of community because religion is like, even though we're not all the same religion kind of gives you that as an individual. So to have it in school, it made the learning and everything, it kind of strengthened the learning and the development that was happening, because even if you weren't a part of it, you respected it just because it was religion. So even if you'd never prayed in your life, by the time the trip was over, we would be getting ready to have dinner, and we would all say the prayer that we learned in the school, even if it was like, no, we can't eat because we didn't pray, and we're going to pray before we eat. We're going to give thanks for what we have. And yeah, it was.
Well, it was interesting too because we were there during Ramadan, and there was a very large Muslim population in Freirand, as well as a very large Christian population, and you never really saw. It was very accepting, like of all religions, even though you would have two very different religions, and like I said, you would have a very Christian theme with a lot of students celebrating Ramadan, and it flowed.
One of those songs that they sang before, like they had meals, was like, "Thank you, Jesus, for our food, many, many, many thanks, blessings, many, many blessings."
Should we do it correctly?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father, for our food, many, many blessings, many, many blessings. Amen. Amen.
I appreciate you. There's another one. It was like, but there was that was really popular. It was called "Fishing for Jesus."
Jesus any day.
Yeah. So it was just, you just kind of got really accustomed to all of the incorporation of it into the daily routine. Ashley?
Brave souls, by the way. This is very inspiring, and this is my grad school hat. Just doing a lot of learning around international education has been interesting the last month or two, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating as an advocate on behalf of children and families. So I'm curious how you all are how did you approach reflection around, I'm using frustration because I can only imagine what it's like to be in a place and then have that parallel in America and realize the pressure of policy and procedure that realistically when you go somewhere else, like these children are still thriving when you take off those American eyes. It just doesn't look the same. And kind of negating the global childhood, saying, well, this is the marker of quality for every single child on earth, which is not true. So how did you guys approach reflection to I can only imagine how frustrated I would have been there. So how are you kind of dealing with that? I don't know if I'm, like, how are you dealing with that? I don't know, I just feel like that would just be so frustrating. Or just set the fire to your advocacy.
I mean, Legina talked about how we struggled. I think that was the big thing in the afternoons. We would come back and everyone would have a different fire. Like, yeah. I saw this today, I saw that, what about this back at home? And I think it was hard. We would share with each other and try to problem solve, talk about all our experiences. Journaling became bigger for a lot of people. I think now it still is frustrating, and it still is like a process, and it's still going to be like a process for me individually, I think, reflecting back on it.
Frustrating in what way?
Well, I think I would view it as frustrating because, when we're, looking at other countries and, again, how they're able to kind of like thrive and go about their lives, and when they're dealing with so much community trauma, right? So we talked about apartheid a little bit. So all of these things that are kind of still in place, where in America, we're in some of our communities, we're kind of going through similar parallels, but still teachers are faced with the same pressures. Like, when Chelsea was sharing her experience, I was like, how did you walk in and not be like, type A? Like, how did you, deal with that, but still come back to America and have to assimilate and function in those same kind of boundaries, or say as a teacher, this is the curriculum you follow here in America, whereas like they're just trying to do the best what they have. So kind of seeing those two very different sides of the spectrums and kind of just dealing. So that's what I mean by frustration, like when you've kind of been on two polar sides of early childhood education and kind of meeting in the middle, hopefully for some balance. But
yeah. I would have to say the turning point for me was one day we'd come back from our crushes. I think it was like a depressing day overall, and we all come to Legia with all of our problems and all of our baggage and all of our everything. And that particular day, she wasn't fazed by us at all. And I think the only thing that she said to us was, you know what, guys? You're not in America. And that was her response to 11 students who were, what about this? And some people are crying, and some people are banging their heads up against the wall. Some people are sitting in corners like, oh my God, we're in Africa. And she's like, welcome, you've arrived. And I think at that moment, you realize that it wasn't where you were. It wasn't that you're from America and now you're in Africa. If you went to Europe or if you went to, Australia, the job is to help the children. So as much as policy comes into play, as much as curriculum comes into play, you have to look at the children. Are the children happy? Are the children learning? Are the children thriving in this environment? So no matter who says what environment is correct or incorrect, or which curriculum is the right curriculum, are these children learning? Are these children able to function in their communities and become really great people? And are you going to be a part of that, or are you going to separate yourself because they don't have the right books or they're not learning the right subjects? And then after that, it was like, well, none of that stuff really matters. Like, as much emphasis as we put on it, it only matters up until a certain point. Because if the children aren't your priority, then all of that was for nothing anyway. So once you get there, you kind of have to just step back, step down, because going from being a teacher to being an assistant to a teacher, you have to respect their knowledge of their communities and their classrooms and their kids, and kind of let yourself relearn what it means to be a teacher, because from where they're doing it, it's from a different base in your heart. Because I don't want to say like I put heart into my teaching, but it's like a whole nother heart that you have to give to the program. So you could go in banging, I don't know, a stick on a pot, and we need to change this, and we need to do this, and we need to do this for the kids. But if it's disrupting the kids, your message is lost because it's falling on deaf ears.
And I think it was interesting because I think when we first went in, I remember the first 2 weeks, everybody was like, oh my God, then they were doing this, and the teachers were doing this, and they were screaming. And so I think there was this big culture shock of, this would never happen in the United States, and like, why is this, occurring? And like, really, like, you just have to take 10 steps back and realize that you're in someone else's space, you're in another country, and to just sit back and observe, and you don't always have to have the answer. And I think that that's one of the things that I think we all took away is I think so quickly we feel like we need to have the answer. We need to know the right thing to do at all times, and that it's okay to not have the answer. It's okay to not know exactly what to do. And sometimes the more you just sit and the more you watch, and I think what they started realizing is that, as you progressed and you actually understood that the teachers there was a reason why they were strict, and it might have been different than what we were accustomed to seeing, but they actually had this really deep rationale, and it was working, because at the end it was like, we've never seen children so happy, we've never seen children like working so well together. And so it's hard to really kind of decompartmentalize like what is our truth? What is our truth? And I think we had a lot of kind of deep, heavy conversations about all of that, and like, who says this is the correct way? And I don't know if I'm making any sense, but it's a lot to wrap your head around, and that's why I was saying I think that's what everybody kind of said, is that we talk. I mean, everybody really, I think we really saw that they have a really strong foundation in social justice and equity, and you can understand it in some components, but then when you take yourself out into a whole other culture, it really kind of rocks you to your core, and it helps you. You have to reevaluate everything, and it's kind of one of those things that I don't know if you could really learn any of the lessons that we learned by reading it in a book or watching a documentary. You almost have to live it and go through it and really struggle, because, like Tanisha said, it was tough. I mean, there was a lot of emotional breakdowns on a regular basis. It's just something as simple as not being able to connect with your families. Our blog, I'm glad you liked it, because it was very hard to have access to internet. Yeah. And so, there's so many just little things that we take for granted that, people were very, very sick and didn't always have a nice warm bed to go home to at night. Our first homestay, we promised we wouldn't talk about this, but we were without they were without electricity for 72 hours and no water, and black mold, and going to work every day very sick, with no bathrooms. And so imagine having stomach virus and no access to a bathroom. So it definitely challenges you in ways that you weren't expected to be challenged.
But then what that did for us, at least what it did for me, is kind of like reminded me, or kind of like put me on check about like, this is what these families and these teachers deal with every single day. And so we take a lot of things for granted, like internet and electricity and water and all of these things. However, and then these teachers still go into do their work with a happy face, the children, the families, so it was just really very powerful.
Okay, so we're actually right on time. If anybody has any other questions?
Thank you so much.